So thank you everyone, both online and in person. I also want to thank our co-sponsors, obviously the Institute for Social Transformation, for which I represent, the Science and Justice Research Center, Merrill College, the Humanities Institute, the Politics Department and their Democratic Discourse and Engagement Initiative, Kresge College, John R. Lewis College, and College 9. As we seek to better understand our republic, it's good to acknowledge and recognize the traumas that came about when forming it. This land in which we gather is the unceded territory of the Waswas-speaking Yupi tribe. The Amamutsan tribal band, comprised of the descendants of the indigenous peoples taken to the missions of Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista during Spanish colonialization of the Central Coast, is today working hard to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and heal from historic trauma. That is the traumas that happened here on the campus of UC Santa Cruz. But it's all over. And I encourage you to do more than just acknowledge, but to learn more about the Amamutsan tribe and the work that they're doing, amamutsan.org, amamutsun.org. That's one small piece. Another piece you can do is actually go and support their land trust. Now, some quick housekeeping before we actually begin with our wonderful speakers. Tonight's event will be recorded and will be on our election series website. You can find it at transform.ucsc.edu. We are looking forward to answering your questions, both online. You'll find a little QA button in the bottom of your Zoom webinar. You can ask questions there. And for those of you in person, you should have an index card if you want to ask that. Our wonderful staff will be collecting those in the last half hour. And then Jenny and I will help ask those questions. All right. Engaging digital democracy. So how do we do this? How do we actually participate in our democracy that is so polarized? How do we understand what is truth when our online media channels are clogged with misleading information, misinformation, and narratives that are actually intended to deceive, disinformation? Well, today's speakers are actually on the leading edge of information integrity, empowering us not just the public, not just voters, but also journalists and lawyers with effective information standards to help us constantly be critical and also better informed. To help us with this conversation, I would like to introduce Dr. Jenny Reardon, Professor of Sociology and the founding director of the Science and Justice Research Center at UC Santa Cruz. Her research draws into focus questions about identity, justice, and democracy that are often and silently embedded in our scientific ideas and practices, particularly in modern genomic research. Jenny?
Okay, thank you, Ned. It's a great pleasure to be here this evening. Hello? Is it working? Okay. With Sally Lehrman and Sylvanna Falcón. We couldn't think of a better panel to have this discussion with. So I'm going to briefly introduce them, and then they will give 5-minute intros, and then we're going to engage in a discussion, and then we will be inviting questions from you all, both here and online. So Sylvanna Falcón is UC Santa Cruz professor and former director of the UC Santa Cruz's Dolores Huerta Research Center for the Americas. And is the co-founder of the University of California Digital Investigations Network. Professor Falcón is a scholar of human rights for nearly 2 decades and an award-winning educator. She works with student researchers in the Human Rights Investigations Lab at UC Santa Cruz, which I encourage you to check out, and across the UC system overseeing numerous open source digital investigations, including monitoring voter suppression and disinformation narratives online in US elections. So she's the person you want to be learning from in the next 2 weeks. To learn more about the Human Rights Investigations Lab at UC Santa Cruz, you can go to humanrights.ucsc.edu. And Sally Lehrman is an internationally recognized writer and speaker on trust and news. Lehrman was awarded a Gold Globee as Female Achiever Communicator of the Year in 2023 for her work founding and leading the Trust Project, which she'll be talking about today, and named one of Media Shift's top 20 digital innovators. A journalist on medicine, science, and business, her honors include a Peabody Award, a DuPont Columbia, the NorCal Society of Professional Journalists Distinguished Service to Journalism Award, and the John S. Knight Fellowship, among others. Her book, News in New America, argues for an inclusive U.S. news media, and her co-edited Reporting Inequality, Tools and Methods for Covering Race and Ethnicity was published in 2018. And for those of you interested in these topics, both of these, I would say, are critical go-to sources. So with that, I would like to invite Sally and Sylvanna to open up. And Sally, you're going first? Okay.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Jenny, for such a great introduction. I'm so excited to speak with you, Sylvanna, and have a conversation, as well as with the rest of you. So you've heard some of the false claims about the upcoming election, probably more than some. Many are about fraud. So people voting or about to vote, let's say, who have no legal right to do so, or maybe being encouraged to vote when they have no legal right to do so. And Santa Cruz actually became well known for a case like that in 2020. Some people here might remember a woman claimed that she was able to register her service dog using his microchip ID, and that he was able to vote. Nope. The Register of Voters takes such claims very seriously, investigated it, and found that it wasn't true. But that didn't mean that it didn't make the rounds, and some people believed it, and some people, maybe even now, and Sylvanna would know, are still using that to undermine faith in our election systems. So elections are when we make our voices heard, when every citizen gets a chance to shape the direction of the country, from local, very important local issues, all the way up to who leads us. But it only works if our votes are based on accurate information, not on innuendo or on falsehood. So today's event description that Neb was giving you really highlights what we do at the Trust Project. We work to help people differentiate between reliable news and harmful disinformation. And that's what's necessary for democratic discourse. And that's what journalists like myself really believe in. This is what we've dedicated our careers to do. And of course, the opposite of dis and misinformation is accurate, fair, and inclusive and trustworthy information. And so our job is to try to help you just differentiate, and others as well. And don't get me wrong, I know that journalism has a lot of faults, like we often don't do a great job. But what we do is really aim to serve the public and aim to provide you accurate information by seeking the truth, reporting it, and correcting our errors when we're wrong. So just, and very similar to the way science works, we're always looking to, one, find what's true, like what's underneath some of the phenomena we see, or issues and events for journalism. And then if we're found to be wrong, then it's important considerations to try to correct that in many ways. So I started the Trust Project as a journalist who was very concerned about what I saw happening in the digital realm. So when we look at news on our screens, or information on our screens, anything on our screens, it kind of all looks the same. I think it was more so when I started the Trust Project. But you see information that's designed to sell you a pair of shoes or article of clothing looks and is presented very much the same and equally as information that's designed to convince you to have a particular point of view, and now even to incite you to violence. So journalists, editors, the people that were controlling like how we push out the information 10 years ago, before that, were doing a terrible job because we didn't understand how to navigate this new world. And what happened was we went to the worst thing. So a lot of editors were advising their reporters to write clickbait headlines. Or they were saying, it's okay to merge opinion. They were encouraging journalists to blend a little opinion in with their reporting because they thought that would give more of a voice. And that's what people wanted online, they thought, was a voice. And then they would do things like run celebrity photos in a series, or run mugshots. People who had just been arrested weren't even like charged with a crime. And so, of course, trust was dropping in journalism, because why would you trust something that not only looked like everything else, but behaved like everything else? So my thought was, like, we really have to change this picture. Trust was declining, year by year by year. We were losing our audiences. It made no sense. We weren't doing what we set out to do, which is to serve the public interest with accurate, informative news. So the idea of the Trust Project is to provide, really flip that picture and make it possible for people to identify news, journalism that really is meant to serve the public interest, that is built with policies and practices and standards that are intended to ensure, to provide guardrails around the information that they gather, to enable technology companies to do a better job surfacing trustworthy news, because they were doing a terrible job. And some may argue that they still are, but at least like we're building that in, and they are using the trust indicators in their systems. And then now we are realizing how helpful and important these trust indicators that we've developed are just for media literacy. So our news organizations now, all of them, there's 300 throughout the world, through Europe, Latin America, Canada, and the US, who show what we have developed. There are the 8 trust indicators that tell you who and what is behind the news. And each trust indicator has multiple attributes that help you know who funds this news organization, how do they separate their business interests or even the political interests of the owners from the reporting. Who's the journalist? What kind of expertise do they have? Do they label opinion? Do they label paid content? So there's a whole series of things, even to the point where if it's a controversial or an investigative story, where a news site will not just give you a bunch of links where you don't know where they're going, but will provide a set of almost, well, really much like references at the bottom of the story, explaining the date of the source they used, the resource they used, and the name of it, where it came from, and give you a link to go there. And we're encouraging sites to even link to bios of the people they interviewed. And you're starting to see more of that. So we were able to get all these news organizations to do that work. We found that other news organizations have followed along. So what we're trying to do is build structural change within journalism. One, to enhance and strengthen that integrity that we started out for in our field. And then provide the tools and the resources so that not only other news organizations continue to do this, but the public and the technology platforms also can use this system. And then just as an example of how that has worked, when I first started the Trust Project, editors, they refused to publish their ethics policies on their pages, because they said that's gonna open us up to legal liability. Like, we shouldn't tell people what the rules are. And I really pushed for it, and now you'll see that that's very common. And not only that, it's one way you can tell the difference between a trustworthy news site and one that isn't. Because one that isn't will either sort of fudge them or you won't see them at all. So there are many ways, and we'll talk about them more. I hope that you can really differentiate between trustworthy news and everything else out there. It's sort of the opposite side of the coin, what Sylvanna's working on. So she's working on helping you identify the misinformation. What we want to do in tandem with that is elevate the trustworthy news. And I want to emphasize both are so important, because you are part of that equation of helping trustworthy news survive and be heard and be listened to, and helping to push that misinformation literally off the page. So I'll stop there.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for being here tonight. Thank you, Jenny, for your introduction. Thanks to everybody in the virtual space, including my mom. Hello. Thank you so much to the staff for organizing this important convening tonight. So I think I should begin by being as clear as possible that democracy is in danger and that danger is online. Our upcoming elections in 2 weeks from today, some of us are going to have to let go of maybe some nostalgia we had about what it felt to be part of Election Day because so much has now changed. In 2019, I founded the Human Rights Investigations Lab at UC Santa Cruz, thanks to seed funding from the Institute for Social Transformation, one of our co-hosts tonight, as well as the Humanities Institute, and the support of my academic department, Latin American and Latino Studies, as well as the Dolores Huerta Research Center for the Americas. In addition, I collaborate with two stellar UC colleagues, Professor Alexa Koenig of UC Berkeley and Professor Jessica Peek of UCLA. So together in 2020, the three of us co-founded the University of California Digital Investigations Network to establish a global academic training hub for diverse cohorts of students to use new and emerging technologies to tackle the world's greatest human rights challenges, while providing critical capacity to external partners dedicated to social justice and the truth, these public interest fact finders worldwide. We've worked with journalists and media outlets to track the spread of mis and disinformation on a range of subjects, from the COVID-19 pandemic to voter suppression in the United States, to police violence aimed at protesters worldwide, to tracking the posts of the most flagrant violators of disinformation in the social media ecosystem. We unfortunately now have to coexist with an online environment replete with mis and disinformation about elections, pandemics, and wars. If we want to ensure a healthy dialogue that promotes democratic values and human rights, an astute point, of course, that Sally has made through her work, then the ability to interrogate information that we're viewing online, to identify fake and false information, is now a necessary skill set every single person who goes online needs today. As we recognize in our work at the Human Rights Investigation Lab, social media posts can create a digital trail of dis and misinformation, as well as proliferate hate speech and conspiracy theories within seconds. How can this troubling trend be countered effectively to get to the truth, especially at a time in which we in this country are on the cusp of fascism and authoritarianism? I'm a scholar of Latin American studies. We are on the cusp of fascism and authoritarianism. I don't think we should be in denial about that. With the increasing presence of deepfakes and shallow fakes, how can we separate fact from fiction to promote trust? How can we verify the reliability of the content we encounter online? These are the questions that we explore in the Human Rights Investigations Lab as part of the UC Digital Investigations Network. Beginning in September 2022, student researchers in our labs launched an independent online investigation to monitor voter suppression and intimidation, as well as disinformation narratives during the US midterm elections. We relied on publicly available information on the internet, from online news articles to social media content to expert reports, and we produced 3 reports from that research. One was kind of an overall report about the work that we did. A second report was on a summary list of election deniers and skeptics who prevailed during the midterm elections. There was a very prominent mainstream narrative that they lost in that midterm elections, and we found that they did not actually lose as much as we were led to believe. And the third report was on how viral videos helped spread election denialism in Arizona, specifically Maricopa County, in 2022. The labs are helping to reestablish a faith in facts, and not just for the English-speaking audiences. Spanish language mis and disinformation has spread in the United States and throughout the region in ways that are alarming. And it's impossible to deny that these high-profile proponents of election disinformation with presidential aspirations all mimic one another. From Javier Milei of Argentina to Jair Bolsonaro of Brazil to Donald Trump here. They all relish and feed off of the frenzy of circulating and spreading disinformation to extend their fascist and authoritarian agendas, ambitions, and dreams. My friend from graduate school named Carl used to have in his email signature, quote, "Dissent is the lifeblood of democracy." What's happening right now with disinformation is not dissent. It is gaslighting. And it's so deeply dangerous that we cannot look away, and we must defend democracy by not only voting, but cultivating digital literacy skills to improve our consumption of news and information from the internet. That is what we're striving to do with the Human Rights Investigations Lab. that are part of the UC Digital Investigations Network. Thank you so much for letting me share a little bit about our work, and I look forward to the discussion with Sally and Jenny and with all of you this evening.
All right, well, so I'm ready to delve into it. And, thank you, Sylvanna, for reminding us of just how important this conversation and these topics really are and how much is at stake. I want to begin with some context. Then I want to give you all both of you a chance to tell us more about how you do your work. And then we'll broaden back out again. But I want to start just by contextualizing where we are by asking you, Ned already introduced this distinction between dis and misinformation, which I'm hoping you both can also speak to, like what is the difference between dis and misinformation. But to provide a kind of historical context, I also want to add the question of how is this the same or different from propaganda, which an older generation would have been used to, thinking about in terms of the Cold War propaganda, World War II, Cold War. So that's my opening question. Difference between dis and misinformation, and how is that the same or different from propaganda?
Well, maybe I'll start with the
start.
mis and disinformation. So I think it's interesting to think about where does it start? Mm-hmm. So really the difference in misinformation, just to put it clearly, is information that is just wrong and you might not know it. Mm-hmm. So you're sharing that. Disinformation is information that is deliberately planted to be wrong. And what happens is, for instance, with the Tim Walz video over the weekend, you may be familiar with that, where supposedly there was a video where someone was accusing him of having molested them in high school, and it was fake. It was, but the U.S. intelligence services found out and reported that was a plant by Russian operatives. Mm-hmm. So it started there, and those who study this issue will say, well, it doesn't need to be spread everywhere. It can be just planted here and there. And then it gets picked up by networks who are interested in promoting a particular point of view, and then it gets picked up by politicians, by parties, and so it starts to expand and become, instead of disinformation, more misinformation, because people are spreading it without really knowing, is it true or not? And then it becomes almost accepted knowledge, or something that has to be refuted and rebutted because I hear it everywhere. And that's the danger, one of the big dangers of misinformation that emerges from disinformation, because when you hear things over and over, you're likely to begin to believe them, and it becomes harder to refute it. So the kind of fact-checking has become very difficult to be effective because of that, because you're just refuting what someone believes and sort of has heard so many times that they just think it to be true.
I think the one thing I would add around mis and disinformation is that sometimes there's just like a kernel of truth. There's like something a little bit true in what's being said, and then it's manipulated to deceive, to manipulate, right? That's where it becomes, dangerous, and it can fall into, spaces of propaganda. I think it also depends on who is actually articulating the mis and disinformation. If it's your peer student and it's just between a few of you, that's misinformation. You just have the wrong information that you're circulating. But the disinformation, this comes from typically very powerful people, right, that are meant to confuse you, to manipulate you, to get you to not believe what you're actually seeing. And that's where it becomes, extremely problematic and dangerous. But that little kernel of truth then gets used in ways that are quite dangerous.
Yeah, that's a great point. And to the propaganda.
Yeah, propaganda.
Yeah, it's very much the same for the same purposes. What's different is that the tools are different, and the tools now are so powerful. And in the World War II, it was, or before that, the rise of Nazism, it was radio. So people could listen to the radio in a cafe or a place gathering spot, and it was just blasting out propaganda. And now we're seeing it spread in a lot of different, very powerful tools, even through AI. And the other thing I would add is I think we have a tendency to think that it's only the other side that uses mis or disinformation, but that's really not true. And especially, that's one of the really sad things I'll say that's happened in the last couple of years is we're seeing it become almost okay to say things that aren't true because you think the other side is doing that or has done that. So this is something that I think we really need to watch for and guard against.
Yeah, and sometimes, I know in one of our investigations where we were looking at, we had our awful fires, not that long ago. And people were posting on X or on their social media platforms like, oh my gosh, the fire has broken out in this area of Northern California. But then my students were able to geolocate, that means geographically locate the image, and that was nowhere in California. So what is the intent of deceiving people around the fire? Right, and so so that's what Sally's saying. It's not as if it's all one-sided. There's other kind of duplicitous actors and things happening at the same time. But I think the one other thing I would add is the speed of the way in which disinformation circulates. So when we were monitoring that viral video in Maricopa County, I remember my students kept hitting refresh. They're like, oh my gosh, because it was like 100, 200, 300, 400. I mean, it was like within seconds, right? It was going viral, and they were seeing it go viral in real time. That to me is the terrifying part, because then once it goes viral, it's almost it's impossible to kind of retract. And then once it jumps platforms, so they would see it on Twitter, and then suddenly it jumped to Facebook, and then it jumped to Instagram, right? So once it starts jumping platforms, we're now in a real danger zone. But this kind of spread is just so fast that that's what makes it very, very hard to challenge.
Sounds like a wildfire.
It's a wildfire.
The other thing I was thinking about in terms of the difference now is, when I think about propaganda, I think about the organized state doing it. And this leads me into my question for you, Sylvanna, which is a question of, now it seems like the mis and disinformation is coming from multiple sources. This is not like the US state organizing through the CIA, FBI, whatever, to propaganda. This is coming from multiple sources. And I wanted to ask you, in the work that you do, how do you identify the sources of disinformation, and how does it help to understand where it's coming from?
I mean, that's such a great question. So with the students, one of the first things we, train them to do, and I say we in terms of the broader sort of network, is to first, do some fact-checking of the source that you're citing that you think is telling you the truth. And a lot of times they've discovered they're bots. It's not even, it's saying something that's compelling because maybe it's aligned with their values. And they, you instantly want to believe it. But once you start actually doing a little bit of interrogation of who is this source and how long have they been doing this and all these kinds of things, you actually realize there may not actually be a person behind that kind of post. And then I think the other aspect of it for the students is once they actually start to identify and use things like the trust indicators that you've developed, right, is to really understand that there is truth out there. And that it is a matter of just being very, very conscientious about the way you're interrogating the source, the information that's being provided to you, and that you actually fact check the source, right? So when I mentioned that earlier example about the fire, the students are able to actually geolocation, we call it, geographically locate an image, right? And that actually then, okay, yes, this image is saying it took place, this political conflict or this political protest took place in this part of Colombia, and yeah, we actually found the road. We actually found that location. I trust this source now, because a lot of times they're looking at sources that are not from the US, and so they might be less familiar to them. But those kinds of techniques really then bring them confidence in what they're looking online. And all my students who graduate from the lab say they will never look at the internet the same, or look at the news the same, or they know to actually ask questions about what they're looking online. So I feel like my work is done.
Okay.
Part of my work is done.
When you say ask questions, I'll follow up real quickly, because I'd like for the audience to be able to have some take-home, easy things to take with them. What would you say your number 1 or 2 questions are?
Well, I would say instead of questions, I would say actions.
Okay, actions.
Do not immediately repost something.
Okay.
You see something, pause, take a breath, and see if you find other sources that are also reporting that same situation. There's a way in which we want to be like the first one to retweet or repost or whatever something. No one wins on that, right? So I say that would be my first tip, is just to pause and take it in and ask, you know, is this true? Is this, can I verify this? Should I maybe spend a little bit of time? Maybe I need to get off online because I've been online for 6 hours. You know, I mean, that's where most of the common mistakes are happening with people who are really well-intentioned and are just wanting to share because some voter suppression is being reported somewhere. They just want to let people know, and the intent might be good, but maybe they've been online too long, and you kind of lose some of your, you know, critical thinking skills because you're tired and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, I would say that, just pause.
So can going on more walks make a more robust democracy?
Yes.
Yes.
And talking to each other. Talking to each other.
Well, and how does emotion play into that, do you think?
Emotion, that's such a great question, because I think, you know, when I think about the students who come to the labs, you know, they are good-hearted, want to do good in the world, you know, students. And so when they see an injustice, it is totally natural to want to like tell everybody, I've just seen this injustice on Facebook. I've just seen it. I'm so upset by it. Like it's a natural reaction. And so part of it is like, okay, well, let's dial it back and let's do a little bit more questions. Let's look into this more. But it is hard to sort of curtail your emotions, because in general, if you're a good person and you see something wrong happening, you want to do something. That's just your natural instinct. And so it's a bit about like, okay, we're going to do something, but let's just get some of the fact checking done first.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important point. Like, I think we tend to think, you know, it's rationality.
Yeah.
We just need rationality, and more information will clear things up. But it's also, Sally, thank you for bringing this up. It's a very emotional issue, and I'd like to come back to that. But for now, I wanted to ask Sally, you talked about the trust indicators. I think you said you have 8 now?
Yeah.
Okay. So how do you come up with those? Let's start that.
Yeah, well, so the way we came up with the trust indicators, we used a process called user-centered design, which you may be familiar with, where you design something kind of in coordination or by consulting the people you're actually designing for, which might seem kind of obvious, but often it's not done in engineering, and that's why some of the products you use, you're like, why is it open like this? But anyway, so we used this idea, and we went out and talked to people in the US, and then expand it to other places, Europe, and we want to continue this. We do continue it. We just finished last year a group of Native Americans asking, or indigenous people, but they asked to be called Native Americans, Native peoples, about their relationship with the news. So we went out and talked to people about what is it that they value in the news, and did they value the news? What was kind of their news journey, like how do they engage with it, and then how they decide to trust it. And then what we did was take those needs and wants, as we call them, from the public, and then brought them to senior news executives from US and Europe and Latin America and increasingly Canada and the other places we work, and tried to engage with that and see, well, what is it we need to be offering people? Because remember, it all looked the same, and how do you show you're different? So what do they need and want, and how do we marry that with what we know journalism to be? Like, what are the fundamentals of journalism? And so out of that came 8 trust indicators, and they all like have multiple attributes, and so components that need to be described on a news site. And they're meant to show you, and I can go through them quickly with you.
Yeah.
First thing was people asked about, well, what's the agenda? We understand journalists aim to be impartial, but nobody's really. So what is your agenda? And our agenda as journalists is to serve the public interest. So we have to put guardrails around our work to make sure that we're not serving like the corporation's interest a bit more than the public, or even our own biases. So how do we try to protect for that? And so that's what we call best practices. That's one trust indicator. So there's policies and practices and information about who owns the site, and again, that separation. Ethics. Then information about who the journalist is. So if you think about trust, it's a lot about relationship, and do I rely on this institution or this individual
to uphold the kind of same values I have or the ethics I have? Are they experts in their field, or at least attempting to learn enough so that they can report it carefully and accurately? So that's that one. There's information. Do they separate news from opinion and other paid content? Do they include diverse voices? This was something we heard about over and over. So believe it, and editors were surprised. They're like, oh, people really want to know. And so people wanted to know, they understood the value of news as a way to connect us. So to help people understand others who are different from them, and also to provide them a voice in this public space. So that's diverse voices. Another one is engagement with the public. So how much does the news organization really try to invite you to help them correct their errors, to report on stories that matter to them, not just what matters to the editors, and to sort of develop this news agenda together. And I really see that as important because it's about building relationship and building this common purpose of informing our democracy. And let's see, I know I'm leaving one or two out. Oh, local. So people want to know, do you know me? Do you know my community? And references methods. I mentioned that before. Like, where did you get your information? And how did you go about it? Why did you even decide to report on this? So those are the 8, and they have multiple pieces that we ask all of our news organizations to report out to the public on their site in various ways, like in very specific ways, but unique to their own space. And then also to provide the actions that support that. So diverse voices being one, where you can't just say, like, we do this, but we want to know, like, is your staff diverse? What are you going to say about that? And what are your policies and practices to really promote inclusion in your reporting?
And kind of like, you know, if a building meets certain standards, like sustainability and LEED standards, you see this stamp on the building. Do the news agencies that you work with, do they get a T?
Yes, you're right. Of course, thanks for mentioning that. Yes, so if they go through this whole process, we do this training. First, they go through an evaluation, because we have to be really careful. We've had sites apply that really are driven by strong political interests, and they shouldn't be part of the Trust Project, because that's not what journalism is. That's propaganda. Or if not propaganda, it's at least just like trying to bring people over to your point of view. And so then they go through this training. We check whether they're compliant, and there's this whole engagement process of coaching. And then at the end, then we check compliance a couple times, and they get the Trust Mark logo. So if you're looking for, well, am I going to be able to see these trust indicators, you should be able to find them very easily on any site that carries that Trust Mark. But as I said, they're also a really good tool for any news organization to check anything. And even beyond, I was talking to one of our people that works in Brazil, in fact, and he was saying, well, I see this as spreading throughout the whole information system. Like, people should be looking for these on the kind of consumer site where they're trying to show you which TV is better, or what, that's probably a really outdated example, but what speaker is better. And so, it's a way of building a structure of transparency and authority and integrity across information, so that, and also very much responsive to the public.
So I want to delve into context of mis and disinformation. So is this the same problem everywhere? Like, you're working with news agencies all around the world. You're thinking about sources of misinformation all around the world. And also, how is it being talked about? Are in other parts of the world, do they use that language of disinformation? So does this problem, is it the same all around the globe, or are there important differences?
You want to start, Ben?
Where to start? So you know, before we started the event, I was telling Jenny, you know, this is the thing with social media. There are no borders, right? When misinformation travels, it spreads quickly, and it doesn't just stay within a particular national context. And so some of what we saw, like the viral video in Arizona, you know, it's a good reminder. The world watches our elections, right? They are paying it because they know of the power of the U.S. elections, and who's in our government affects them, right? And so it was interesting to kind of see these viral videos at the midterms actually reach Spanish language markets, right? And also through, the Facebooks and the WhatsApps and all these other kinds of things. But, part of what it's important to sort of keep in mind is that, news travels in ways that transcends any kind of national borders. And there are as many influential Spanish language influencers of disinformation as there are English. They're all over. They're all over. And that's it again, it makes it a global problem. It's really kind of a global threat. And that's why when I mentioned in my opening remarks about, they all copy each other, their tactics of disinformation. And so, and that's how come we know it's not unique to the US per se. Some of the divisions that are sort of galvanized here are unique to our country, but the need to sort of confuse people, that's universal.
But trust is situated. And one of the things that we know about trust is, at least from the work that I've done, is that it is culturally specific as well. And so I'm wondering, Sally, as you've worked with news organizations around the world, are there concerns the same around the world or different in places?
Yeah, well, this was something really interesting in our research and also in the work that we do every day with newsrooms and with their audiences. Because we weren't sure, we didn't know if the trust indicators would resonate in other parts of the world. And to be fair, we do operate in Hong Kong, but we don't in really anywhere in India or other parts of Asia or South Asia. We also aren't in Africa, but we have heard from people in those regions who really want to be part of news organizations that really want to be part of the Trust Project. What we have found is the trust indicators are transferable. So that this idea, those key components of are they really seeking the truth? Do they share our ethics? Are they reliable? Are they going to be consistent? Those are things that emerge across multiple countries and peoples. What we find are some differences in sometimes how that's expressed or the way the news operates. So less about trust and more about how the news operates. And just like Sylvanna said, at the same time, news is distributed around the world. So a news site in Latin America will very well have people in the US reading it. Or in Spain, it's being read in Latin America, and so on. So there's all this transfer of news. So we really have to think globally when we think about both misinformation and trustworthy information. And one of the things also is the targeting of certain populations within countries, I think, is another commonality. So in the US, for example, targeting Latinos and Latinas with certain information that these bad actors think will either deter them from voting or cause them to think of a different way about who they should vote for. That gets planted in places like WhatsApp. Or maybe it spreads from Argentina to San Francisco. So there are deliberate attempts to both target, and we found this with Native peoples as well, like both target people as objects of disinformation. So saying things about certain populations that aren't true, like we've heard many of them in recent weeks. And then at the same time, objects and subjects, as people to try and direct disinformation at. So again, to try to change their behavior. And what we heard from the Native populations that we talked with, there were individuals that we did these very in-depth, what we call empathy interviews with, was one, they feel deeply, many people talked about feeling deeply harmed and hurt by the way news traditionally has covered them, but also feeling so really hopeful about the potential for having access to accurate, truthful news in their communities, because many times that access is missing. So this combination of really strong hurts and harms, but knowing the power and the need for accurate information about their communities by and for their communities.
You know, you saying that makes me wonder, through the Trust Project, are you also cultivating a way for more diverse journalists? You know, so some of the Native people that you are interviewing, providing on-ramps into actually having stories in those sources. So, that's one of your trust indicators, is this representing the community, is it local? But are you finding that this also opens up a conversation with the news media outlets that you're working with? Like, how do we bring more diverse voices into the production of our content? Is that happening?
Well, yeah, and the Native research was a good example of that, and I would really like to do more. Like, that's something we're really thinking about. Because what happened was we always, like I mentioned when we designed the trust indicators, like we brought all these editors together. So with the Native research, we brought together some of our editors from throughout the US and Canada who were interested in learning about the research. And then we brought in some Native journalists who had helped guide us in the questions and really helping us be culturally sensitive. And then we brought in a few of the interviewees and the participants, I should say. And we had these conversations about, well, where should we take this work? And I will say, like, the first thing was we had to really, unfortunately, push some of the editors come. Like, they would say, why? Like, we don't have Native people in our state. And I'm like, really?
Yeah, oh my gosh.
And, or like, they're not in our city. And one of our points is, well, Native people are everywhere, and they're very large, small in some ways, but also very large and very important, influential population. So that was like the first win, getting them in the room. And then once we got people in the room and they're exchanging and all this ideation happened, and people get so excited. And so we had collaboration between Native News Site and a major national news organization right out the gate. We had an organization decide to try to do a collaboration with a university to bring in interns from the university to become journalists. And so things like that bubble up. And it takes some, these organizations don't move quickly, partly because they are moving quickly trying to cover the news, so they don't institutionally change that quickly, but we're hoping we'll see more.
I'd imagine the underfunding and cutting of to journalism is also a hampering force. But I want to take a moment to remind everyone that we're going to turn it over to questions to you all. Ned, I'm sorry to ask you this, but for questions from the audience, or should they be writing those down, or?
They should be writing them down
on note cards. Okay, so in about 5 minutes, or 5:10, because we can also intersperse questions coming from the audience, and we can turn back. I have, because I don't want you all to have to sit here forever. I'm sure you have burning questions. So I also have more questions, but I want to kind of make this be more of a dialogue. So I'm going to ask one or two more questions. I'm going to bring AI into this. How could we avoid that, especially here? How do you feel like AI is impacting the creation of disinformation? You've been talking about bots. So who are the actors here, and is artificial intelligence one of them, and what is it?
I mean, AI is absolutely one of them, and is one of the bad actors in all of this, and it just gets more sophisticated every day. And so we're noticing more deep fakes when it comes to election information. Deep fakes meaning it's just harder to tell, like, that real, like, I believe what I'm seeing, it doesn't look like it's a manipulated video. It's usually easier to tell shallow fakes, because they're like, oh, someone just did that on their own video editing program on their laptop. That was, pretty easy to sort of tell some of those. But the deep fakes are so sophisticated now. That, because you're moving faces, you're doing all kinds of manipulation, that it's extremely difficult to tell if it's a deep fake without like access to the metadata and all these other kinds of things. This has really complicated the elections, because we're seeing more deep fakes, and this is what journalists are asking us to document. We're going to be doing our own election monitoring in a couple weeks. They're asking us to trace the deep fakes because they have just exponentially grown just since the midterms to now.
And how are you identifying the deep fakes?
Well, some of them we're identifying just through our social media. Like, we do have social media discovery, where we spend a lot of time online trying to collect information that's circulating about the elections. And if there's videos attached to it, we will then try, and usually if we can geolocate it, then we'll know it's not a deep fake, but sometimes we, in just the analysis of the videos, we can tell it's a deep fake.
Yeah. Sally?
Yeah, so AI has been a really interesting conversation within journalism because on the one hand, it can be really useful, and that's true across any field today, like almost anywhere. And you're finding it's being like everything you touch nowadays has some AI component that you may not even know it's there, or you may be asked to choose to use it. So it can be useful in news gathering, but there's always, like beyond like the deliberate deepfakes, there is the hallucination. I know you're already familiar with that probably, but it's where AI, like it's trained on a certain database, and if it's the whole internet, then two things can happen. One is that when you think about the internet reflects, one, all that misinformation and disinformation that's already there, the biases of people that are putting information into it or coding it, and then also AI has this generative AI, has this tendency to make things up. If it can't find the answer, it'll make it up. That's right. So, I mean, we hope students don't do that. So, so this is the risk, and I think it's really important because to think about as individuals who are interacting with information all the time. So it's happening deliberately, but it's also happening in ways that might be very subtle in the information you see. And one example would be where, and it's kind of an economic example too, where now if you look in Google search, you're looking for something, you will see a summary at the top instead of a set of results. And that summary is an AI summary, and not everybody even is aware of that, because it's not real clear. And what it has done is gathered information from different places and put it all in one spot so that you don't have to go click through. Now, Google would say, well, we're not trying to keep people from clicking through because we do provide the links, but essentially that's what happens. Now, so first of all, can you trust that information to be true? Early on, there were a lot of concerns and actual findings that it wasn't necessarily true. Like you'd click through and the information would be something different. I think they fixed some of that. But at the same time, now you're looking at this thing that has been created for you by a machine, and you're not necessarily clicking through to the news sites that are putting their journalists on the ground trying to gather the information through all those standards and values I described for you. And now they're not getting your attention, so eventually it becomes this system where the technology is pushing out the information to us instead of the people who we rely on to be out on the street, finding out what's true and what's not true and presenting it to you in the best way that they can. So it's a big economic issue, and there's a lot of debate between technology companies and news companies about how can we protect the value of all this technology and make it not technology, of journalism within the technology, because ultimately the technology relies on the original work by the journalists too.
Is that okay? Okay, so I think, unless you want to...
Yeah, I had one question for Sally about what struck me about some comments you made earlier was how the power of collaboration. And I wondered if you could speak more about how that power of collaboration and the work that you're doing and the relationships that you're cultivating in the community, like what, just if you could speak a little bit more about the power of that connection that you're seeing in the work.
So between news organizations?
Yes.
Or among them? Yeah, it's amazing because when we started as the Trust Project, it was highly, highly unusual for news organizations to work together. It's a very competitive field. Everyone wants to get the story first or best or, something somebody else hasn't thought of. And so we had to work to get people to come together, but they really responded because they saw the problem and were very concerned about it. Like, we want people to trust our work. We need that. And it's not just because we care about our words, but we care about journalism as a public service. So that was great. And what happens internationally is so exciting because you see And across different sites of different sizes, you see like someone in Spain advising someone in the US, or one competitor talking to another, people in Brazil. We had a thing on journalist safety, because a lot of journalists now, due to misinformation, are being attacked on the streets. And what was happening in Brazil is it was like physical attacks. And it hadn't happened yet in the US, but it was starting to. And it started out, I remember I told you about the anxious, well, I didn't tell you about the anxious middle, I was going to tell you about the anxious middle, people who are anxious about news. And what emerged out of this discussion about people who are anxious about the news was journalists who were anxious because they were finding themselves so at risk. And so here we had conversations between Brazil and US and Europe and Canada, all talking about this sort of problem and advising one another and sharing. It was very powerful. So we see that kind of thing happening many times, the sharing of best practices, and also sharing practices about how to engage with the public, because that's also a big priority of our work. Like, don't just treat people like consumers of news, like we're dumping this information on you and you get to accept it or not, but as real partners. And I encourage actually all of you to think of yourselves that way in this environment where we really are challenged by the information we're seeing. Don't just be a consumer or someone who's sitting back, letting it fall on you. Engage and challenge and hold news organizations accountable, hold the information accountable, provide suggestions. And you're not always going to get a welcome hearing, but I think more and more you will.
So we're going to turn it over to questions from the audience, and I think we can go back and forth between in the room and online. I don't know if you want to, do you have a question that you want to start with? Yeah, in the room?
Definitely directed towards Sylvanna.
Oh, the mic. Yeah. Is that okay? Sorry.
How does geolocation of deepfakes work? What tools do you use to track them?
So great question. So the main way in which deepfakes and geolocation intersect is if you have like a video, a deepfake video, you use this one platform that actually creates screenshots of all of the images. So like it turns a video of 10 seconds into 20 screenshots. And then you try and study the background to see if you can situate where this person is or where this location is from. And sometimes you can actually, prove fairly easily, like this place doesn't exist, we can't geolocate it, we can't verify it. And other times you're like, well, something about this image is true because it was filmed here, but this person, we figured out is actually an AI-generated person, right? There's just, all kinds of, ways in which the technology intersects with deepfakes in that way.
So I think there's a bit of conversations on the online chat about just general fact checking. How do they do it? And I think there's a great question. I think it's coming from an educator. So putting it all together, can you be more specific on how to fact check? How do you find the source of online content? How would you recommend educators to teach media literacy in their classrooms?
Should we start with that one?
I know, yeah. Well, maybe start with so one thing is the trust indicators. So there's 8 indicators. You can find them on our website. It's thetrustproject.org. And we have a page that has just the trust indicators. And it's a very user education friendly way of just describing what these 8 things are and what to look for. So like, who is this journalist? What is their expertise? Do they tell you who funds them? And we also have on our website some tools for, in fact, for university libraries. It was developed by Santa Clara University to help students who are developing their research or papers to know, like, are the sources they're using accurate, and to use the 8 trust indicators in order to do that. So that's one thing. And I think what Sylvanna was saying about the pause is really critical. So really, before you believe anything, be sure and pause and think about, like, is it just because you feel like met by it, connect to it because you agree with it? Good not good news in the sense of positive news, but journalism that's done well will challenge you, will ask you to ask questions, and will provide you multiple perspectives on a story. So that's one clue too, as to whether you're really looking at journalism or you're looking at something that's designed to convince you of a particular point of view.
I mean, I think, when you think about the trust indicators that Sally's laid out for us, part of where I start with students is just identifying a few reliable sources. You don't have to have 30 or 40 at your fingertips in order to believe what you're seeing. But if you have you start with a handful of reliable sources that you feel confident in what's being reported, you see that there has been a pattern of accurate reporting and acknowledgement perhaps when mistakes have been made, if that's happened, then you sort of feel, you can trust this source of information. Oftentimes in sources cite other sources, right? And then you start building out your network of reliable information, right? Because you see this particular source that you have faith in, because you have noticed a pattern of truth-telling, that now who are they engaging with? And they're likely engaging with other truth-tellers. And so then your network of sources expands.
Yeah, the other thing I would add too, is that's a really good technique, is don't rely on just one or even a few sources. Like really try to diversify your sources. So you might find one that you feel is really good at covering science. We'll look for one that might be good at covering environment or looking at different topic areas. If you yourself are left-leaning or right-leaning, pick a site like that, but also pick one that really challenges your point of view, but at the same time you find is trustworthy. Like don't just go out and find an extreme site, because that can give you, then you might get pulled down the rabbit hole. But really look for, we really talk about checking and cross-checking as journalists. I think the public needs to do a little bit more of that as well. Not to the point where you're like going out and researching everything you read, but at least giving yourself a diverse news diet.
Yeah, I think you need a diverse ecosystem of information. And I also think the worst thing that we do to ourselves is we fall into echo chambers, right? And so that is the one thing, if you're noticing that habit, like you're just in an echo chamber and just hearing from people that agree with you all the time, and you must be on the, on the right side of this information, you might also want to just sort of challenge yourself a little bit. Because why am I comfortable in the echo chamber? We're usually comfortable in the echo chamber because we're not pushed. And asked to question why we believe what we believe in. So it's important to sort of expand that. Yeah.
I think this is a quick follow-up. There's some folks who just want to know how to find the trust mark on websites, and then there's a bit of conversation around, can you name certain websites or journalists or news sources that you would actually really trust in these times? I think some people are questioning, there's a couple people who have mentioned Ground News. I don't know what exactly that is. It looks like it's a media aggregator. Is that reliable? How trustworthy is corporate media? New York Times, Washington Post, like what are the influences? Are there trends that you've seen from the Trust Project?
Yeah, well, I would say, again, it gets to diversity. So yeah, the corporate media, like big companies, or what we call the corporate media, big companies that are well-funded, like the New York Times and the Washington Post, are going to go out there and really report the news. But at the same time, you need to balance that. And I don't know why I keep going to Brazil, probably because I talked to them today. But so you have Folha de São Paulo, which is this big newspaper, probably one of the most important in Latin America. So maybe read that, but also read a very small one called Nexo, online only, or Asmina, which is all about feminist news, or one that comes from the rainforest and is reporting from that perspective. And you can do the same in the US, where you're looking, or Santa Cruz, for heaven's sakes, like this place. We talk about news deserts in the country, like places where people just can't get access to news. You've got multiple news sites competing with each other here. We're so fortunate in the Bay Area we have that. So you have sites that are written for certain populations or produced for certain populations, like Spanish-speaking populations, or El Tecolote in San Francisco, that is speaking to both, I think it's Mayan peoples, plus Spanish, plus English readers. So you might have that, and you also read the Chronicle, and maybe the New York Times too. Now you're getting a nice mix. And this is what this is what we're seeing. I hope that helps answer the question. So I wouldn't say like
a healthy diet of media, news consumption.
You can't trust or not trust certain types of news, I would say, other than be very careful. I don't know ground news, but be very careful with sites that are just aggregators of other news.
That's right. I agree.
Because they may be aggregating certain kinds of news, and you're not seeing where the reporting actually came from.
So there's a really insightful question here that talks about how we're really microfractured in our social media channels. And so in those echo chambers, how do we actually address, how do journalists address this? How do, folks, lawyers, and how can we as voters really face mis and disinformation? What can we do about it when the audience is so fractured?
Well, I was thinking about that because I was wondering how you your students are finding this disinformation. And so how do you push out the results so that it hits all those little spots?
Well, I mean, and for us, we either publish our own reports or we work with other media outlets who then use our data for their story. So we've got a few who are very anxious about this election, and so we're partnering with them to help them be able to tell the stories that they're trying to tell. One of the stories that, one of the outlets is following is targeting it to veterans on disinformation, that this has been an upswing, uptick, and I think it started a little bit with questioning Waltz's military record, and it's, again, that thread, right, that now has galvanized into more concerted efforts to target veterans. And so your earlier question, Jenny, about communities, I think it's very important to realize it's not a one-size-fits-all disinformation, right? There are ways in which those actors are also make that disinformation culturally specific.
Exactly.
And can I ask you just a little bit more about those actors?
Yeah.
I mean, so we hear about, Russian, influencers. I assume that's a batch of actors.
Yeah.
But what are the, does the, do the different campaigns have people working with them on this? What do these actors look like?
You mean in terms of helping spread?
Yes.
Well,
yeah.
I feel like we see that a lot in one of the campaigns in particular.
Well, I mean, yeah. I'm just not inside their campaign. I don't know how it actually works.
But I think there was a lot of success in confusing people at the midterms in 2020.
Right.
And so all that's been happening, or one of the things that's been happening, is perfecting that strategy that seemed to get them some results in previous elections. So yeah, I mean, and part of it, it's a little opaque. You can't be like, you're the bad actor, you're the same one. They shift, they change.
Right. That's
and that makes it hard.
Yeah, that's one of the difficult things.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then to continue on the social media thing too, that is a major challenge. And I think if you followed what's been happening with Meta and Facebook and TikTok and X now, there's such a struggle within those organizations. Like, how much are they going to try to tamp down misinformation? In the past year, they have really just pulled back, many of them, in terms of the staffing of those areas, and kind of shifted people to different places. They say that is still helping. What we don't know, because we haven't seen really the results fully. What we do know is that it's still these spaces are replete with mis and disinformation. From a journalism standpoint, news organizations, we've been encouraging news organizations to try to get into spaces. Probably the most troubling for us are places where people can privately talk to each other and kind of develop memes and belief systems without any external interference. So TikTok being one I'll start with WhatsApp. WhatsApp being a place where that happens because families and communities will talk to each other. And you can't inject news particularly. You have to kind of try to lure people into news, and they did start the ability for news companies to create news channels. So that's a hopeful sign. TikTok is a place where because of the way the algorithms work, people, like news has a very poor chance of competing. And so we just invite news organizations to talk about the trust indicators, talk about their integrity, while they're also trying to engage people with news. So, I mean, I think it's just a really tough challenge and one that we all need to work on. And one way is to try to pay attention to what the algorithms are feeding you. Yeah. And don't just be this passive absorber in any of the spaces that you're in.
These are the questions from the room?
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll take some questions too from the room here. So, so given the climate of disinformation, why do you think political debates aren't fact-checking live more? Although we did see in the debate that just happened, there seemed to be some live fact-checking going on. So I don't know if you have thoughts about that.
I mean, wasn't that interesting? Because I know there was a kind of a whole conversation, like, what is the role of the moderator? Like, should they be fact-checking and shouldn't and I'm like, yes, they should be fact-checking because they're, the reach that they're having, you know, on that stage. And so, you know, that conversation, the fact that that was even a debate was fascinating to me. And that's where we are, that we really cannot trust what's being said in a presidential debate because of the ways in which they've been able to use confusion to get votes.
Yeah, and there were a lot of journalists who were very unhappy about some of the agreements that were made about not fact-checking. I mean, I think as a field, like, there was a lot of concern that that was allowed to happen. But at the same time, it was, I mean, there were the question ended up, like, are we going to have a debate at all? Or are we going to have one where certain constraints are put on the moderator? And then the other question, too, like, what is the role of the moderator? And I know in some cases they tried to do, like, this whole separate fact-checking thing going on. Are people really going to go there? Probably not. I mean, except the real diehard news junkies.
But I think Sally's point that, the fact that the political campaigns negotiate the terms in which the debate is even taking place, like, we should question that. Why is that even happening? There's no negotiation to be happening. You're speaking to, you know, the American public, and everything, you know, there's no need to negotiate in that way. But that's what our political process has come to.
I mean, there's some interesting questions in here about are we to a point where we need the government to step in and regulate? You know, like, what steps is the government taking to regulate AI in ways that will combat disinformation? Is it? And another person asked, do you think legislation limiting, combating misinformation, disinformation is required? So this is a question about the mechanisms of dealing with this problem. And you've been talking about, you know, what news media is doing, but is there a need to collaborate with legislators?
Well, there's a lot of discussion and debate over how much, like, what the regulation should be and where and how much regulation should there be. What we see is there are repercussions for regulation too. So one example would be in Canada, and in this case it was regulation to try to get the big technology companies to pay news organizations for the news that they were distributing through these tech platforms, because most of the advertising also ends up with the tech companies, not with the news companies, but the original work is being done by the news companies. What happened was Meta completely pulled out of Canada. So now you cannot share news on Facebook unless you do, like, these kind of workarounds. So we see that when regulation is attempted in some cases. And then there's the whole question of free speech and how do we navigate that? I think in Europe they're making a lot of efforts to both look at helpful regulation of technology, distribution systems of news and information, with misinformation, disinformation as the target. And they're also looking at how to regulate AI. So I think we're going to see more progress there, more debate, and perhaps things that will be followed in the US or not, I don't know.
Yeah, no, but I think Europe is going to be having those conversations before we do.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
There's some frustration about your opening remarks about fascism in America. And I just wanted to give you the opportunity to address that and make a connection between fascism historically and now, and how what we're seeing today is being mirrored or not mirrored historically and in Latin America, given you are an authority on this.
Okay, so I don't use that word lightly. I just want to be really honest about that. But when a candidate is telling you, I want to be a dictator for a day, I've never seen that. And he's vocalizing authoritarian impulses. That is, we're on the cusp of fascism. So I think what feels awkward, I think, to U.S. audiences is we've bought into this belief that it just couldn't happen here. But it can happen here, and it's happening here. And other countries in Latin America in which they didn't think it would happen there, it happened there. And so it's important for, I think, the US voting public to not think of themselves as disconnected from the world, and that we are not somehow isolated from the sort of geopolitical factors and dynamics in which fascism can happen here. And so you see it at the attacks on the journalists, you see it with the wanting to have political appointments in civil servant positions. It's just like things that are happening little by little. Those are the undercurrents of an authoritarian regime. And I saw the former chief of staff, Mark Kelly, say today that he called him a fascist. I don't know if you know military people, but they don't use that word. In the U.S. military people don't use that word. And so I was struck that he is even using that word. So I think we need to recognize that the alarm bells are ringing around us and not pretend that somehow because we're Americans and we're in the U.S. it couldn't possibly happen here. Many of us didn't think January 6th would happen here, the insurrection, and it did. And now it's being framed as a convening of love. And it's again, one of those things it's the gaslighting. It's to make you think, did I not see what I think I saw? And the further distance you get away from it, the more you think, well, maybe it wasn't so bad. Maybe it wasn't to that extent. And you start to then manipulate the public into actually believing that one of the candidates is not as scary as they actually are.
One question that I didn't ask earlier that I wanted to ask that relates to this is, what is the relationship between misinformation and the problem of violence? And we touched on that a little bit, Sally, when you talked about journalists being attacked. But I wonder if we could speak more directly to that.
Well, I mean, you just can hear anyone who went to January 6th and the reasons they went. Right? They were very open. They went because they were told that the election had been stolen. Where were they told this? On Twitter, on their social media platforms, on the ecosystems that they were engaged in. That was we see a direct connection there between disinformation and violence. And so this is why this is not a game that we're in right now. This is very, very serious. And why I think you see a lot of journalists that I've been talking to a bit on edge about what is going to happen in 2 weeks. And almost the expectation of some kind of violence, whether it's at the voting places or what have you. And we shouldn't normalize that. We shouldn't normalize that. What do you think, Sally?
I think that I wonder where we are heading, and I wonder, as journalists, we have to observe and not say, like, we're going to go here or go there. What I wonder, though, is there are many people who perhaps, is it fair to say, would like to see a change in our, the way we operate as a country. We would like to see a more authoritarian government.
I mean, perhaps that's where we are. And that's in part because I think people don't know what it means to live under authoritarian regimes. And so some of the folks who are ringing the alarm bell the loudest are immigrants who fled authoritarian regimes, because they know what will happen if that becomes, something that we normalize. So.
Yeah, and at the same time, we also hear, this is part of how the disinformation happens. We see immigrants who are concerned too about what might be more of a government that's more like communism.
Yeah. Yep.
So there's this debate going on, and it's being manipulated, I would say, in many, many different directions and ways.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And there's this question that's come from the audience about what is it that we're not hearing? How does information that isn't covered or left out play into dis or misinformation, which I thought was a really perceptive question. So.
Well, I think it's, from a journalism standpoint, it's huge. Yeah. So, and it comes from, sometimes, most often it would come from journalists who are not seeing parts of the world, people of the world, even issues and actions. And as journalists, we need to work really hard to make sure that we pay attention to that. So when we talk about what is truth or isn't truth, part of what we have to do is think about, well, what is in our minds is truth, and correct for that sometimes. So what I know and believe and see comes from my history, my background, my culture, my family's origins, even where I grew up, where I was taught, and all of that leads me more easily to see certain things and miss other things. And so we collectively as journalists, part of it, and we were talking about with covering Native issues and people, part of it is making sure we bring in diverse voices into the work we do. Part of it is each one of us thinking about, well, how can we learn to see and learn to listen differently? How do we really learn to listen to all the voices of America and and not just America, but around the world and all the various places? And listen, and I really mean listen, because sometimes journalists will go out and what they will hear is what they are thinking about someone or about what they think that person thinks or believes. And this gets to politics too, like talking to a conservative person or a liberal person, there may be certain assumptions about what they will tell you. And so we really have to, this is just a way that journalism needs to continue to correct for this internal bias that everybody has and every institution has.
I want to just pick up on that for a minute, because I think that's such an important point. I think that when we talk about misinformation, we think the answer to that is to get the correct information. But the answer to that might be to listen and to cultivate the arts of listening. And I think, I've been spending a lot of time in my home state of Kansas, cycling around, talking to farmers and ranchers and other denizens of the prairie. And, that has meant me talking to people who I would have otherwise never have talked to. And that requires a sense of curiosity about people who I would have otherwise maybe never thought that I should want to talk to. But having that curiosity, not coming in and prejudging, and teaching and cultivating the art of listening and the art of, and also the practice of curiosity about others. I think this is an ethical issue as much as it is a factual issue. And I think that often gets lost. And that goes to the point about emotions, which we were talking about. When you make people feel like they're wrong or dumb or uninformed, it isn't persuasive. So I wonder what, we might, I know we only have a few minutes left, but I'd be curious, thoughts about that and how it's possible to cultivate a culture more of curiosity and openness in the field of journalism and in our society. It's a challenge, and I hope universities are partly a place for that.
We're set up to do that, right? As the university, we're supposed to be spaces, cultivate spaces of dialogue. I think the pandemic has affected us in ways that we don't quite fully understand, in terms of the connections that have been lost, maybe the communities that we were around before that we're not around anymore. It's hard sometimes to sort of cultivate those meaningful relationships, and there was like a very rapid disruption in that. And so some of what you're talking about, the curiosity, I think some of that has been deeply affected as a result of the pandemic and being isolated and being disconnected and not knowing how to talk to one another and just to have healthy disagreements. I mean, I always tell, I tell my students too, like, I don't actually want to just talk to people who think like me. That's not interesting to me. I actually do want to talk to people in which I maybe have a very different view, or and I'm talking to everybody, but like a lot of people have very different views about things, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're a bad person or they're trying to hurt me. There's just a different lived experience there that I could learn from, and they could learn from me, from my lived experience. But I think you need to, take the time to form those relationships. But I feel like we haven't quite gotten out of the sort of COVID isolation that many of us are still dealing with.
Yeah, I think the COVID isolation is part of what has enabled dis and misinformation to take off for the very reasons that you just said. Right. So, I mean, some of the things we can do, it's a huge problem, a huge question. But that listening is very important, as well as exploring together. Yeah. So expanding that curiosity to learn together. So let's say we encounter something that we might disagree on. Well, let's explore together, not debate or argue about it, but explore together, and hopefully maybe starting with things that are a little bit easier. And then it's just about really understanding too where our commonalities are. So part of what this hyper-partisan environment we're in right now is teaching us that we're all so very different. We're different on the coast than we are in Kansas. We're different depending on our skin color or depending on what language we speak. But in fact, there is so much that we share individually and collectively, and that's where we need to start. And also really thinking about it and bringing it to information. Like, we have this commonality. We all care about, truthfully, we all care about the betterment of society. We might disagree about the direction it should go, but this is where seeking truth can help us together.
Well, I want to thank you both for your work and also for the conversation tonight, and thank the audience for all your really very insightful questions as well. And thank you to the Institute for hosting this.
Thank you.
This is the 5th of 6 events in our election series. We do have one more coming up on October 30th. It's called Decoding the Headlines. So in this one, we're actually going to be reading the top news stories and misinformation of the 2024 presidential campaign and helping you decipher those ones. I also want to make sure that everyone here knows and they are empowered to vote. So make a plan to vote. Online registration in California, I think, is closed, but you can still show up in person and register even up to the day of. And with that, I want to
some good information.
Thank you all for your work, for showing up, and for everyone online and here. Thank you very much.